Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Tiffany Mink. I am a marketing associate here at Interview Valet, and thank you everyone for joining us. Last month's event, we talked about the state of podcast interviews, and we had a great turnout for that. So thank you for joining us. For this month, we are talking about the podcast interview lifecycle. Now, this month is a little bit more complex. Last month was all numbers and trends and data. This month, we're really diving into the complexities of an idea and the life cycles that those ideas follow, and how you can overlay that into your podcast guesting interviews. So if you did not get that report already, I will drop the link over in the chat in just a moment, and you can get a copy. Before we get started, we have the chat over there. If you have any questions or connection issues, just drop it in the chat and we'll try to help you out. Stick around for the end because we will do a Q&A session, and also we have an announcement for what's coming up next month. So stick around for that. And with that, we are going to get started. So let's welcome Interview Valet's very own Tom Schwab. Hi,
Tiffany.
Tom.
Tiffany, thank you so much. And I am excited to talk about this. And anybody in the team has heard me talking about this and working it out in my mind for about the last 6 months, because there was always that foundational question when people would come to us with that pain of like, well, when do I start the podcast? When do I start hosting my own podcast? Or when is it too early or too late to do one? And
Right.
I had this gut feel, but until we could put a framework on it, it wasn't clear. And we've gotten a whole lot of clarity over that in the last 6 months. This is the first time we're presenting this, so it's exciting. And I think once people see this framework, they're going to go, oh yeah, that makes complete sense.
Absolutely. It's one of those things, you don't know it, and then once you see it, you're like, oh, it's been there all along. And it can apply to anything, any idea, any concept.
Yeah, and you can't unsee it. So from the standpoint, once we really figured this out, I was like, I'd see a new podcast come up that just took off, right? And it's like, oh yeah, they use that same, podcast interview or podcast idea life cycle. You'd see a new television show that would launch, and it's like, oh yeah, it's the same cycle. Or a book would launch. Seth Godin brings out his newest book. It's like, oh yeah, those are following all that. Or even retrospectively, looking back over the last 8 years, the last 1,000 clients, and going, oh yeah, back in 2016, that's why this person had such great success with it, and why this person did great but didn't see the same results with it because they were in a different stage. So it'll be interesting to go through this and then even talk about some examples, have some questions and answers, and see how people want to apply it to their business.
Exactly. Well, let's get started.
All right. Well, if you know me, you know that I'm all about graphs. Right. And people in the team have seen this bell curve for so long, and they're like, what is all of this here? So it's the idea that everything has its time. There's different cycles in a podcast interview, or I'd say even in a idea. Now, everything has a season. It comes from the Bible, and also a great song way back when. And if you look at the different seasons, if you will, or the different stages in a life cycle of a podcast or an idea, there's 6 different ones, and we'll unpack each one of these. You start out with that seed phase, then you go to launch, then you own it, and then it starts to become a commodity. Then people start to copy it, and then it becomes a commodity. And let's be honest, there are certain times where it just becomes laughable. It becomes an embarrassment. And there's certain times to promote it, certain times not to. Now, any graph, right? It's got to have axis on it, right? What are we talking about here? Well, everything progresses with time, right? And what is that time scale, right? I don't know. It varies for different things. Some ideas, some interview topics, some campaigns can have a very, very long time frame. Other ones can be very tight, right? If you're talking about something in crypto or NFT, we've got a lot of clients in that now. That cycle is very, very short because it changes so quickly. Other ones tend to be longer. So sometimes some leadership topics, some health topics can be longer. Even some business topics can be longer. But one thing I can promise you, the world keeps speeding up. So when you thought you had, years to talk about this, no, you've probably got a lot less. Maybe you've got a few quarters to talk about it before it drops off into that copy, commodity, and laughable. So that's the x-axis. Well, how about the y-axis? And I told you, I'm a geek, right? I am the person that actually thinks of this in the XY axis. So the bell curve, as it gets higher and higher, what does that mean? Well, it's really more about potential, right? So what does potential mean? Potential impact. It could be potential clients you could get. It could be potential sales. It could be potential profits, right? And nothing lasts forever, right? That's the idea that we'll go through this, right? Everything starts to go up, and then you've got to notice when that turns, when there's that inflection point where it's like, this is time to get off the wave, right? Because the profits are going to go down, the sales are going to go down, the impact is going to go down until the point where it just becomes laughable. So let's dive into each one of these different areas here. So let's start off with the seed phase. The seed phase, you look at it, there's not a lot of potential there, right? You're not going to get huge payback on that, but it is so, so important. That's when you're starting a new idea, a new idea for a book, a new idea for a business, right? You're using podcast interviews to get market feedback, to see how podcasters respond to that. You're using it to see what podcast was this a base hit on, and what was this on a home run? Because when you go into the next phase, you want to double down on what's working. And sometimes people will skip this seed phase and they go into the next phase without the foundation, right? They just want to get out there. It's almost like I want to fire the gun. I want to ride the wave. Well, you don't know how it's going to work out yet. So start to get that baseline. And sometimes for us, this could be a quick guest storm, right? Let's do this for 90 days to get that baseline point. Other ones, it could be farther. You might have to do, a 6-month campaign on that, depending how fast it is, and also how ready you are to launch. There is no sense in doing a complete launch if you don't have the product to fulfill. I was just talking with a client. They've got a new product coming out. They want to get out there on podcast interviews, but it's not nationally rolled out yet. Well, why would you launch it and do a complete launch if, a third, maybe half of the nation is just going to be frustrated because they can't get it? So that's the seed phase. And we'll dig into these a little bit more. So you go from the seed phase and then you start jumping into the next one. And the next one is the launch. This is the fun one, right? And if you look at that, this is where you're going to see the big potential. So when you're actually launching that book, when you're launching the program, when you're launching that idea, where you've got everything built, ready to convert those listeners to visitors, to leads, to customers, right? At the launch phase, you may have multiple, we call them talents, right? Multiple guests talking about something. There could be different personalities, different viewpoints. It could be a male from your company and a female from your company. It could be different people. Maybe your CEO's talking about it from a strategic standpoint. Maybe some of the marketing people are talking about it. Maybe you've even got clients. We've had customers before that were in the launch phase, and they brought some of their students or their customers in to start talking about it from the user perspective. And this is fun. This is where the Navy, we used to call it fire for effect, right? You're getting on lots of interviews because you've already done that seed phase. You know it's going to work, right? You're not just testing something out, just throwing a lot of stuff at the wall. You're getting out there on there. So we had the seed phase, then the launch phase, both of them could be as short as, a guest storm, which is 90 days. A launch phase actually might be 1 or 2, what we call brand builders. So you could be talking, 2 quarters, maybe even 4 quarters with this. But at a certain point, you've fired at all of the big targets, right? And you just don't want to keep going out there and doing more and more, because guess what? Your competition's going to come after you. And that's the pain you want to avoid, of you starting it up and somebody stealing that market from you. So with the next one is really jumping into what we call the own phase. And this own phase is really the last cycle that you want to be in as a podcast guest on interviews about this idea, because this is when you want to get out there and make sure that people know it was you that came up with the idea. You're the category king behind this. The own phase is a great place to start your own podcast. A lot of people will come back and say, well, should I be a guest or a host? Well, you be a guest if you want to get more leads, if you want to get more exposure, right? When you become a host is when you want to nurture your current leads, when you want to nurture your current customers, when you want to own that market, right? And if you do that too early, it can become an embarrassment, right? You launch the podcast, nobody knows what you're talking about, nobody follows it, and then the podcast dies off. So that own phase is very important. But we also talk to clients at the end of this own phase. It's like, what's the next thing? Because what we don't want to do is start riding this wave out. And people say, well, we've made so much money. We've made such an impact, but you can see it start to fading off. And one of the things that you can see with that is when all of the sudden you've got more and more people that are starting to copy you, right? Where all of a sudden other people are using that same language as you and saying, oh yeah, we're just like this person, right? And it's like, hold it, that's my idea. No, that was your idea, right? You can't copyright, you can't protect ideas, no matter what patent lawyers have said. I've always said, and the people in our company know this, that one of our values is our only true competitive advantage is our ability to innovate and execute quickly, right? They're always going to copy what you did. They're not going to copy what you're going to do. So at this point, you better be very careful about riding that wave down. If you're the one that started that idea, you owned it, don't get in there when people are just starting to copy it. And for God's sake, don't go in there when it's a commodity, right? When's a commodity? When people go, well, we're just like this, or we're the best of this, right? I love it how Christopher Lochhead from the Follow Your Different podcast and Lochhead on marketing always points out that that competition is for losers, right? So if you're in an area and you're saying, well, we're just like this one, only we're cheaper. We're just like Salesforce, only we're cheaper. That competition is for losers, because Salesforce, who owned it years ago, the data says they're getting 78% of the financials, of the profit, and everybody else is just fighting over that commodity status. Now, you would think most people are going to get off of the wave and start something different when they get to copy or commodity. But unfortunately, you see some people that are trying to ride that wave all the way to the beach, right? I'm gonna ride this as far as I can. Everybody else has stopped; they're paddling out for the next thing, and then you've got some people that come into the next stage, and that one is really when an idea comes laughable. And I don't know if laughable is the right word, or sorry, or pathetic. And I've seen this before where somebody comes out with an idea and it's like, that's really cutting edge. And the idea never changes. Their talking points never change. And you could listen to an interview they did today or 6 years ago, and it sounds the same. And so with that, it really it's not impactful. They're not converting anything, and almost at that point, the potential of getting on interviews is so slim also, right? As you reach out to a podcast host, the podcast host isn't saying, "This is a new idea. This is exciting. I've never heard about this." They're like, "People are still talking about that?" So one of the nice things about the market is the podcast host won't sort of let you on. They'll look at your topics, your ideas, and say, "No, thank you." So in a little way, it's sort of merciful when they do that, and you don't get on there. So we've got the 6 stages there, right? We went through the stages of something being a seed. Then you go to expanding that into the launch. Then you own it. Then you want to get back to in your idea, you want to go from the idea of seeding, launching, owning, and it's an upward spiral on that. And so with that, Tiffany made this graphic, and I thought it was beautiful on here. Let's see if there we go. It's this spiral, right? Don't ride the wave up and down. Always keep going around, right? So start with an idea, spend a campaign to seed that idea, to learn about that market, then launch it, right? This is fire for effect, where you're going to get that big, big potential, but realize other people are watching you. They're going to start copying that. So put the defensive things in there to own it. And when everybody else starts copying it, that's when you need to come back and seed another idea. And it's in some ways this graphic, I love it, right? Because it shows you it's a continual cycle, but it's almost 3-dimensional, right? So if you think about it, it's more you start here and you keep spiraling up and up and up with that. And so with that, each one builds upon itself. And let me give you an example. Pull behind the curtain here. When I was thinking about this, I was looking at my own experience, right? And one of the things that really struck me is how our business had changed in that, and where we've really come in this. And so total transparency here. If you look back at Interview Valet, about 2015 to 2017, we were talking about the power of podcast guesting, right? How podcast guesting was leveraging other people's audience, how it was so much like guest blogging was 15 years ago, right? How you could do that. We seeded that. And when we first started talking about that, people would say, "What do you mean by that?" And so we had to explain it. And then all of a sudden it really resonated. We figured out what audiences it worked best on, and we started to really launch. Then we got to that own phase, and I'll be honest, I think we lost something in that own phase because I didn't appreciate what we needed to do at that own phase to really make sure people come back and said, "Podcast guesting, yeah, that's Interview Valet was one of the early ones that was talking about that." Because now we were just at Podcast Movement, great podcast conference last year in Nashville. I don't think there was a presentation up there that didn't talk about podcast guesting, whether it was for an SEO strategy, whether it was for building your brand, whether it was for launching a podcast or taking a podcast to the new level. Right now, podcast guesting, just as a topic, is probably in that commodity phase. So in 2017, we started to look at it and say, there's more to it than just podcast guesting, right? I was going on any podcast and, to me, exposure was good. More exposure was better. And then I realized it's not really working anymore, right? There's got to be something to this idea. We're missing something on this. And so with that, we looked at it and said, well, really, it's not just about being a guest. It's about marketing, right? It's about podcast interview marketing, right? Guest blogging is a tactic. Podcast guesting is a tactic, but content marketing or inbound marketing is different. So in 2017, you saw my book come out, right? Podcast Guest Profits, How to Grow Your Business as a Targeted Interview with a Targeted Interview Strategy. And could somebody on the team, I am not selling the book, put the link on there. You can get a free copy of that if you're interested. But we started to talk about that, about all the different steps that we use internally to get results from every podcast, right? Because nobody goes on a podcast just because, hey, it's an ego thing. No, you go on to build your brand, build your business. So in 2017, we started to talk about podcast interview marketing, and it was really, really different, right? People were like, I thought it was just podcast guesting. We started to talk about that. We started to launch that. And then you started to see people talking about, well, there's got to be an algorithm for how you pick podcasts. How are you going to move people and progress them? You see people start talking about welcome pages. And I think this time we did a much better job at putting it out there and owning that, yeah, this was ours. And we did some things, but still, I think we missed some opportunities there. Well, last year I started to think about this, and it's like, yeah, there's other things, because even when podcast interview marketing works great, it doesn't work the same for each one, right? How come when somebody is just talking about a new idea for the book, it doesn't work as well as the impact, the sales, everything like that, as when they launch it, or when somebody rides the wave too long? Because there's different segments they're in. And so with that, we looked at it and said, okay, really, this year we're starting to talk about that podcast idea, or the podcast interview life cycle, and one builds on itself. It's that the graphic that Tiffany made that was so nice, where it shows, seed, launch, own, seed, launch, own, and it's this upward spiral here. And often we talk to clients and it's like, what is next, right? It's not just one campaign. Each one should build upon itself. And with that, you want to continue that momentum going there, right? You always want to be out there. You're only as good as your last appearance. People's time frames are short of what they listen to. So I've ranted a lot about this. I want to bring Tiffany back, open it up for some questions here, and really apply this to different people's businesses, different people's problems there.
Yes, absolutely. I love your analogy of the upward spiral. I think people might be concerned, hey, I'm doing the seed, launch, own stages, and then what? Well, you go back to seed. We start over. While our product or our idea is still going out into the world and spreading out, you get back to work on your next topic, next idea, next book.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you're not just chasing your tail, right? You're not just going in a circle. You're really spiraling up, right? Nobody puts the ladder up and goes straight up. And, if you just keep spiraling up, one idea builds on the next one, and one campaign should always build on the next one. And that's one of those things that we talk to people about, where the idea of a campaign, right? We always look at campaigns, a guest storm, which is 90 days, or a brand builder campaign, which is typically 2 quarters. And, you know, they're like, oh, can't I just try something for a month? No marketing is going to work for you for a month, right? You're not going to
Right.
see anything. But then I scratch my head sometimes when I hear people in the industry going, "Well, there's a minimum 1 year engagement." If you just seeding the idea, you don't need to do that for a year. If you're doing a book launch, and doing that guest storm to hit a list, you don't need to do that for a year, right? So one size doesn't fit all. And that's one of the things that I'm really proud of our team, is that we focus on getting the results, not just getting an interview, right? People go, can you get me on podcast interviews? There's 2.6 million podcasts out there. You don't need anybody to do that, right? If you want to grow your brand, grow your business, we'll have that discussion.
Right. And I think that's where people, they it's their ideas, right? They own it. They live, eat, breathe it, but the world doesn't know about it yet. And so it's new news to everyone else. And yeah, so I want to go on all these podcasts, but really they want to get the message out there into the right market, and not just to everyone, but their market. Who cares about their message? And that's what's important with this, is getting to your right audience.
And somebody I saw in the chat there, what's the podcast idea interview lifecycle, right? We're in the seed phase of this, right? So it's where an idea goes from seeding the idea to launching that idea to owning it, and then starting with the next one, because you don't want to ride the wave down from copy, commodity to laughable. And I think it's going to take a few times to hear this, right? We do a lot of webinars. I don't know, call it a webinar, LinkedIn Live. This one is just different. It's like, when we did the first one, how to, the ultimate guide to repurposing and promoting your podcast interview. Boom. People understood that when we said, here's the data, here's the state of interview marketing. People understood that. Next month is going to be, really understood. This one is a new idea. And I think it's going to take a while to go. People go, oh yeah. And it's like any great idea, when it's like, that's weird. And then that makes sense. And then, that's common sense, and I hope everybody looks at this and applies it to their business, because it really is common sense once you see it.
Right. I think it'll be one of those things, like you said earlier in the presentation, of TV shows. Everything kind of follows this life cycle. And it's going to be one of those, they're, next week watching a TV show, and they're like, and it'll click. Oh, I see it now. I see what you mean. Oh, I see how this book, this event, it'll click in other areas, I think, first, before within their own self and their own business.
And I'll give you a couple examples of this. And like with an author, right? Joe Sanic, we worked with him on his book, Thursday is the New Friday, right? And when he first started it, he was just seeding the idea. I mean, before he even got the contract, I think, I'm going to mess up, I think it was HarperCollins that gave him the book deal. He was out there talking about how work had changed, right? How this industrial, 5-day work week, 9 to 5 type thing didn't match today, and how there's different ways to do it. And he was talking about that idea for a while on podcasts and with different people, I think even before he got the title together. And then all of a sudden he started to talk about, maybe Thursday is the new Friday. That resonated, right? So he did sort of that market research there to get the book together. Well, then when we start working with them, it was last summer. It was probably 3 to 4 months before the book launched. He did this launch thing, right? And he got out there on the podcast interviews. He worked hard, and he was out on a lot of interviews, and the team helped him. But he got that idea out there and really launched it. And so all of a sudden it's now, Thursday is the new Friday. And now he's at the point where he's out there on stages and speaking, it's like, oh yeah, this is the guy that came up with that concept. And it was funny. The other day I was listening to the Wall Street Journal daily podcast, and I was like, heard them talking about the future of work and everything. And I'm like, I wonder if they read Joe's book, right? Because now people are starting to copy that idea a little bit more. And when somebody says, you know, Thursday is the next Friday, or Thursday is the new Friday, they're going to people that are going to go, wow, that's a neat idea. But there's going to be a lot of people go, you know what? They just copied that from Joe Sanic. And so that's a great way to do it. Another example with an author would be Seth Godin, right? Take this framework and listen to any of Seth Godin's books. If you want to know what he's working on next, just listen to what he's talking about, because he's seeding those ideas. If he would have come out with the book Purple Cow without ever seeding that idea, people would have gone, is that a marketing book? I think it's a veterinary book, or something like that. So he does that masterfully. And James asked a question here. How do you distinguish between the core message and a specific launch idea or seed? I used an analogy before of fire for effect. And I'm sorry, I'm old, and I'm a naval veteran, right? So there was a concept in the Navy, in naval bombardment, that was called walking something in or firing for effect. Right. And so in the olden days, you'd have a battleship and they would be after a target. Right. And even with computers, you can figure out what's the curvature of the earth, what's the wind, what's the humidity. You do all of this, and guess what? You don't hit the target on the first time. So you shoot it, and then somebody says, no, that was a little bit to the left. So you adjust. That was a little bit to the right. That was a little bit short. And you keep walking that in. Once you hit that target and you know that it's going to work, then you ramp that up. Then you fire for effect and everything unloads. So, James, when you talked about that, I would ask you to consider, do I know that this idea has legs, that the market is accepting it, that I'm talking to the right people on there? If I had all these people come back, could I accept that? Is everything built up for that? If you could say yes to all of those, then it's time to launch. I'll give you another example here. Craig Cody, early client of ours, right? Craig is awesome. He's a CPA, a tax strategist, and he's also got more personality than any CPA you've ever met, right? He's a retired New York City detective. So when he came to us early on, he said that he wanted a different customer in every state, in every different industry, right? He was trying to diversify, right? And so we started to get him on all these different podcasts. And then with that, what we found out is that we looked at him and said, you did really well on this dental podcast, right? And he's like, oh yeah. He's like, I got a few clients from that. Well, he had done the market research, and he's like, oh yeah, dentists work really well. They've got professionals, they're recession proof. They've got good cash flow. For like the next 6 months, all that we did was get him on dental podcasts. Well, he went from doing podcast interviews. If you look up Craig Cody now, he's got his own podcast. He's owned that market. He's got a podcast about the business side of dentistry. And so if he would have gone out and said, I want to launch my business, before he figured out what market was his ideal market, he would have wasted a lot of time and a lot of money. He figured out what was working and then doubled down on that. Oh, sorry, Tiffany. I'm not sure if I muted you or.
I apologize. That was my fault. We have another comment over here in the chat from Robert. He says, how long should a book launch be as a podcast guest?
Yes. Great question. And I would ask you, what's the goal for it? Right. So there's two ways of doing it. You'll hear us talk about a guest storm. A guest storm, first talked about this on Christopher Lochhead's podcast, Lochhead on Marketing. A guest storm is typically a 90-day blitz, if you will. Right. So if you're trying to hit a list, last year, I think we helped 4 books hit the Wall Street Journal or USA Today list. You start about 3 to 4 months before, and for 90 days, go out there, get all the interviews out there, and then work with the host to say, hey, could you release this, plus or minus a week of the book launch? And so what happens, all of those podcasts typically air. It's like a big fireworks going off. There's ooh and ah, and people buy the book. You get this big momentum with that, and that hits a list. But people's attention drops off after that. So you could do that to hit a list. A lot of people that are doing a book, they want to use that to build their brand. So if you look at somebody like Chris Tuff, right, wrote The Millennial Whisperer. While he hit a list, he also kept doing the interviews at a slower, steady pace. And because he was using that book, The Millennial Whisperer, to build up their entire consulting practice. You look at somebody, a first-time author like Sharon Spano, right? She wanted to get those pre-sales in. She just thought, well, I'm probably not going to hit a big list. So she started earlier and just was fine having those interviews go out there because she knew she had to practice too. So she sort of did more of a brand builder for 6 months before the book launched. And that also helped her craft her message, get comfortable with it, to test things out, so that when the book launched and she started to do TV and radio, she was much more comfortable with that.
Right. Yeah. So it's, again, to you, you're working on this behind the scenes, but once you put it out, it's new to your audience, to the world. And so you have to think behind the scenes, keeping the momentum for yourself, but also the public view, keeping the momentum going for them. And I like how you said, you do a blitz in the beginning when you're ramping up for your book launch. And then once it's launched, yeah, you're not promoting and talking about it so much, but you still want to kind of keep yourself out there. And that's building your stage, your own stage, right? That's solidifying your position as owning this idea and owning that concept.
And, you can even take a current idea and reframe it in such a way to go from one stage to another. And let me give you an example on this. So if we look at this, sometimes I see interview topics, and the funny part is, we make one sheets for all of our clients. And sometimes I see other one sheets. I get pitched to be on my podcast about 3 or 4 times a day, which is laughable. Because I don't have a podcast, everybody loves it and they want to be a guest. And I can remember recently I got one, and this is the person's, was their topic that they wanted to talk about, was how to get rich. I'm sorry. I think that's laughable, right? This is somebody that I have never heard of. If it's Elon Musk, if it's Sir Richard Branson, if it's something like that, it's somebody that I recognize. That's interesting. If not, that's just laughable, right? That's old, right? There's the best-selling book out there. Tiffany, do you know what the best-selling self-help book is in at least in the English-speaking language?
I don't. A couple come to mind, but I don't know what the best would be.
Well, the best-selling, it's Think and Grow Rich. That one has sold more than any other self-help book. So I'm looking at that and going, if this has sold tens of millions of copies, I don't think this person has something that's probably more substantial on that. So instead of just saying,
Right.
here's my topic, how to get rich, right? Well, why don't you reframe it? And I think of John Mitchell. Um, John Mitchell is out of Austin, Texas. It's really interesting. He studied that book, Think and Grow Rich. And, Napoleon Hill in there says there's a secret in this book. And if you study this book, you will find it. And it makes everything else work. Well, John went out and he studied it and he figured out what it was. Right. And then it worked for him. So he helped other people with it. I think he's the a coach to University of Texas, their athletic program and everything. And so he's got this figured out. Well, now he's going out there and he's seeding the idea on podcast interviews. And you're saying, well, if he knows that it works, why doesn't he just launch it right away? Well, the reason is because he is starting to ramp up his team, right? Right now, he's got himself and one other coach that does it. If he went to a full launch, right, he'd get so many leads that he couldn't do those. He's still doing a high touch, high personality, high value program with it. So it's not like he's just got a software model for it. So at a certain point, he might go to having more coaches. That's when he could launch, right? Because his job then will be, how do I get enough leads in to keep all these people busy? You see that something like with EOS right now, as they're franchising out, they're going out there to really, really relaunch that. Or if he's got a scalable, one-to-many program. Another example of this could be, I heard somebody one time talk about, it's the best CRM. Whenever you say best, it's a commodity, right? Don't be better, be different, right? So they're like, oh, we've got the best CRM out there. Well, it's either you are lying or the other 200 people with the CRM are lying. So
Right.
We had a client that we worked with, and it was great because they had a CRM, but if anybody's ever used that, it can be hard to use, right? And it doesn't tell you anything. It's like, especially for sales, it's more paperwork. So they looked at it and took a different idea for it. They said, this is how AI is actually helping your sales team. And it was with a CRM that automatically recorded things, automatically predicted things, automatically helped move them along. So they moved beyond that commodity of a CRM. I'd say the seed phase for them, people already knew what AI was, right? So it wasn't something totally different. And they had a software as a service platform where they could go out there and, they'd spent millions of dollars on this, and every new customer that came in was almost pure profit. So they were out there launching with multiple people, multiple talents, really doing that fire for effect.
Right. It's more of paying attention to your niche audience, right? We're not trying to be the best for everyone. We want to be the best for our people, for sales, for example. Not the best for everyone, best for sales. So it's really paying, the riches are in the niches, right, Tom?
Right.
As you say. So yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it.
Go ahead, Tiffany.
Well, we had another comment or question over in the chat from James. He says, I see how this idea works for a podcaster. How does it apply to an expert guest?
Yeah. I think it's harder for a podcaster, right? Because the podcaster comes in and, once they set the show, they're just doing it to own the space. It's really, really hard to pivot or evolve in a podcast. And a lot of times people will corner themselves in where they can only talk about one thing. That's why if it's a bigger topic, you can evolve with that. To me, this is ideal for a podcast guest, right? Because you have something new to go out there. You test it in that seed market, then you launch it. Then you start to own it. Then you go back to the next idea. Where I see a lot of podcast guests not getting success is they've never tested it in the seed phase, or they're launching 3 different ideas at the same time and it confuses the market, or they ride the wave forever, right? It's like
Mhm.
that person that, I mentioned has been doing interviews for like 6 years and they still keep talking about the same thing. And, it worked really well and then it died off. So if you're a guest, I would always ask you, and we do this with our clients and with our prospects now, to identify, this is where I think you are in the life cycle. So this is what we'll do. I'd see a campaign here, maybe a couple campaigns here, and often we'll talk to a client. It's like, what's next? And they're like, well, what do you mean? This is working good. We've been doing this for, a year, 18 months, 2 years. And I'm like, no, we can already see that starting to turn, right? There's got to be
Mhm.
something else to come in here. It's like, you can't talk about, your new book forever, when somebody goes
Right.
and looks at it and it's 5 years old.
Right. Right. Um, yeah, I think it's you got to keep moving, and that was something you and I talked about before. Of once you hit that own phase, how do you keep that momentum going and keeping it fresh, and to avoid just falling down the wave off the peak.
Um, One of the things is not starting and stopping, right? It should be, it's just that we talked before about that spiral. It should
Hmm.
always be, as you're finishing the own, start teasing the new seed, right? So if you've got,
Right.
in your that own phase, and you're got your own podcast talking about it, well, on that podcast, start teasing that idea for the new one, right? Start evolving into that new one. And the other thing too is, I think all of us, I'll speak for myself, I think I tend to ride the wave too long, as opposed to realizing that it's becoming, when we start out, it's a blue ocean, and then it goes to a red ocean, right? Thinking, oh, it's going to get better. No, it's not, right? It's going to get competition. And, I'm an engineer, right? Second law of entropy, or second law of thermodynamics is entropy always increases. The layman's way of that is, if you think things are crazy today, just wait till tomorrow, right? So it's not going to get better. So start to figure out where that new blue ocean is. And what I talked about was, make sure you don't stop. Go from one to another. It's always that upward spiral. And I want to share a story here, um, that really struck me last year. And there was a gentleman, um, he was really well known out there, did a lot of high level coaching. You saw him on social media, lots of places there. He was everywhere. And then all of a sudden he stopped. And, there's a lot of things going on, right? There was COVID, other things, no judgment here. But what really struck me is, I was at a live event and I was with a bunch of people and his name came up, and somebody said something like, well, how's his family doing now? And I thought that was sort of a weird question. And I'm like, I know, I guess they're doing okay. Why? And they're like, well, didn't he die? And it was like, no, no, he's still around. Right. And they just assumed, because they didn't see him online, that he just went from, full stream to nothing, that he was dead. And it was sad, and it was a little bit awkward. And it's like, no, he's still alive. He's just not on the internet. And there's sort of the flip side of that too. I've got a friend, Sam Malakarjanan, runs a great company called One Screen AI. Um, the guy is the ultimate in automation, and he automates his tweets, his posts, and stuff like that. And I can remember joking with Sam one time, we're all going to be reading his last tweet, 2 weeks after we go to the funeral, because he's got those scheduled out there. And so, digitally, he's still going to be alive. But I started to put it, as a comment. It's called it digitally deceased. And I wrote a blog about this, last year when that happened, when somebody said, "Oh, I thought he died." There's a song from the 80s and the No Nukes. Plutonium is forever, but you're not, right? There is a decay curve. So it's not just like that bell curve where it's going to go off slightly, right? No, when you stop being out there, it's going to start to decay, and it's going to decay like anything else. Like there's a half-life to it, right? People people move on. They see different things, so it's going to decay. And I think you can see this uh, with a lot of celebrities, a lot of thought leaders. If there's not somebody putting information out there, if they're not having content out there, if they're not alive digitally, they start to die. I think of, Zig Ziglar, and my hat's off to Kevin Miller, who was a friend of his, a friend of the family. He's kept the Ziglar podcast going. And, we lost Zig years and years ago. And yeah, is his influence and impact decaying? I guess it is. And that's a tragedy, but there's things that other people are doing. And, Zig for probably 5 decades was out there hustling and working so hard and doing so much content that his peak there was so much higher that even as he decays, there's still people going out there and finding him and going, wow, this is great.
Right. It's creating a legacy for yourself that lives on beyond your years in life. The podcast now, there's a Zig Ziglar show and he's not with us. So he's keeping his legacy and message going. And that's
Yes.
where you talk about optimizing your own phase, right? So that's great. I am not seeing any more questions here in the chat or behind the scenes. So do you have anything else for us, Tom?
Yeah, I guess sort of the bigger picture thing, right? We talked a lot of strategy today,
Yes.
on how to the framework to think that. And I think that's important to have the strategy right before you just start going out and doing the tactics, right? We gave the example of, just shelling a beach or something like that. You've only got a certain number of shells. You've only got a certain amount of time. So make sure that everyone you learn from, that everyone makes an impact there. I think as we grow and evolve in this, we need to learn, we need to share what we have learned. And that's Tiffany. I'm so excited that you're on board with us. We've got 35 team members now throughout the world, but we never really had somebody on the marketing side. And you're doing great things to help. We call it marketing. It's really more education, right? You got all the stuff together so that that first month talked about how to promote and repurpose your interviews. We got all the state of podcast guesting together, that annual survey that we did. This month we're talking about it, and every month we're going to have great information. So I just encourage people, learn from this. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you have any questions, our team is here. I'll be around on the chat here for a little bit. If I don't have the answer, I guarantee you one of the 35 people on our team will have some insights on it.
Right. More heads are better than one, right? Perfect.
So thank you, Tiffany. And I'll let you wrap up here and let us know what's coming up ahead.
All right. Well, next month, we, like Tom said, our goal here is to continue with education. We're striving to always be better for ourselves and for our clients and followers. So next month, we are going to work on, we're going to focus on coaches and consultants and talk about the podcast lifecycle for them. And we will have an event next month. I believe we have it scheduled. Let me check my calendar. It will be April 13th. We'll have another live here on LinkedIn. So join us for that. And once we wrap up here, I will also get the recording and the slides that Tom used today out to everyone who attended. So we thank you for everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next month.